When trust shatters like glass, love blooms in the most unexpected soil, a tale of betrayal, redemption, and the gentle hands that heal broken hearts. The autumn wind whispered secrets through the amber leaves of Millhaven Estate, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and dying roses. Violet Ashworth stood at her chamber window, her fingers pressed against the cool glass as she watched the carriages arriving for the harvest celebration. Her heart fluttered like a caged bird, knowing that among those guests rode Edmund Fairfax, the man who had promised to make her his bride before the first snow fell. The mirror beside her vanity reflected a young woman of gentle beauty, her chestnut hair arranged in soft curls that framed delicate features. The sapphire gown she wore had been her mother's, carefully altered to fit her slender frame. Tonight was meant to be perfect, the night Edmund would formally announce their engagement to both families and all of Millhaven society. "Miss Violet, your father requests your presence in the drawing-room," called Martha, her lady's maid, from beyond the mahogany door. Violet's pulse quickened. This was the moment she had dreamed of since childhood, when she and Edmund had run through these very gardens, making promises beneath the old oak tree. Their families had always spoken of uniting their estates, but what had begun as duty had blossomed into something that felt like love, at least on her part. The drawing-room buzzed with conversation as Violet descended the grand staircase. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled guests, their laughter mixing with the gentle notes of a string quartet. Her father, Lord William Ashworth, stood near the fireplace, his weathered face beaming with pride as he caught sight of his daughter. "Ah, there she is," he announced, extending his arm toward her. "My dear friends, may I present my daughter, Miss Violet Ashworth." The room turned toward her with polite applause, but Violet's eyes searched only for Edmund. She found him near the tall windows, resplendent in his dark evening coat, his golden hair catching the lamplight, but something in his posture made her stomach tighten with unexpected unease. He stood rigid, his usual warm smile replaced by an expression she couldn't quite read. "Edmund," she whispered as she approached, her gloved hand reaching for his arm, "I've been waiting for you all day." He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his green eyes, guilt, perhaps, or regret. But before she could question it, her father's voice boomed across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." Lord Ashworth raised his crystal glass, the amber liquid within catching the light. "Tonight marks not only our harvest celebration, but also a most joyous announcement." Violet's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment that would seal her future, bind her fate to Edmund's forever. She looked up at him expectantly, waiting for him to step forward, to take her hand, and declare his intentions before their assembled families and friends. But Edmund remained frozen, his face pale beneath his carefully groomed appearance. "It is my great pleasure," Lord Ashworth continued, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "to announce the engagement of my daughter Violet to—" "Father, please." Edmund's voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and unexpected. The room fell utterly still, every eye turning toward him. "I fear there has been a misunderstanding." The words hit Violet like ice water. Her father's smile faltered, confusion clouding his features. Around them, guests began to murmur, sensing the tension that now crackled through the air like an approaching storm. "Edmund," Violet's voice barely rose above a whisper. "What do you mean?" He stepped away from her, creating a distance that felt vast and cold. "Miss Ashworth, I must speak plainly. I cannot honor the arrangement our fathers discussed." The room began to spin around her. Violet felt the blood drain from her face as she struggled to comprehend his words. "But you said you loved me. You promised—" "I was young and foolish," Edmund interrupted, his voice growing stronger, more certain. "I've come to realize that my affections lie elsewhere." Indeed, as if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from the crowd. Lady Catherine Pembroke, resplendent in emerald silk. Her dark hair swept into an elaborate style adorned with diamonds. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never known want, never known doubt. Her beauty, the kind that graced portrait galleries and inspired poets. "I must announce," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "my engagement to Lady Catherine Pembroke. We are to be wed before Christmas." The glass slipped from Lord Ashworth's trembling hand, shattering against the marble floor in a cascade of crystal and wine. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room captive, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Shocked exclamations, whispered gossip, the rustle of silk as ladies leaned toward one another to share their scandalous delight. But Violet heard none of it. She stood frozen in the center of the room, watching as Edmund took Lady Catherine's gloved hand and pressed it to his lips. The gesture was gentle, tender, the same way he had once kissed her hand beneath the garden moonlight. "Violet, my dear." Her father's voice reached her through the fog of her shock. His hand touched her shoulder, steady and warm, but she could feel him trembling. She looked up at him, seeing her own devastation reflected in his kind eyes. The humiliation was complete, public, and absolute. Every person in this room would carry the story of her shame to every drawing room in the county. She would become the subject of pitying glances and whispered conversations for years to come. I need air," she managed to whisper. Without waiting for a response, she gathered her skirts and fled through the French doors onto the terrace. The cool night air struck her heated cheeks like a blessing, but it could not cool the fire of humiliation that burned in her chest. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of conversation resuming, probably with renewed vigor, as the guests dissected every moment of her public disgrace. The gardens stretched before her in silver moonlight, and she found herself running down the familiar paths of her childhood, her silk slippers silent on the dew-dampened grass. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, until she could no longer hear the sounds of celebration from the house. Only then did she allow herself to collapse beside the old oak tree where Edmund had once carved their initials, where he had whispered promises that now tasted like ash in her memory. The tears came then, hot and bitter, falling onto the earth that had witnessed both her dreams and their destruction. The morning sun painted Millhaven in golden hues, but Violet felt as though she existed in perpetual twilight. 3 days had passed since Edmund's devastating announcement, and the estate had fallen into an uncomfortable quiet. Servants whispered in corners, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Her father had locked himself in his study, emerging only for meals where they sat in strained silence, both pretending that their world hadn't crumbled in the span of a single evening. Violet found solace only in her morning walks, when the mist still clung to the meadows and she could pretend she was invisible to the world. Today, she wandered farther than usual, following a narrow cart path that led beyond their estate's boundaries toward the tenant farms that dotted the countryside. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and her breath formed small clouds as she walked. She had pulled on her simplest dress, a faded blue wool that Martha had tried to dissuade her from wearing, and wrapped herself in her mother's old shawl. For the first time since the humiliation, she felt something approaching peace. It was the sound of distress that drew her from the main path. Somewhere ahead, she could hear a man's voice strained with effort, followed by the frightened whinnying of a horse. Violet quickened her pace, rounding a bend in the road to discover a scene that made her forget her own troubles entirely. A simple wooden cart had overturned in a shallow ditch, its contents, sacks of grain and winter vegetables, scattered across the muddy ground. A chestnut mare stood nearby, her reins tangled in the cart's rigging, eyes wide with panic. And kneeling beside the wreckage was a man unlike any she had ever encountered in her sheltered world. He was tall and lean, his clothes bearing the honest wear of hard labor. Brown wool trousers, a white shirt rolled to his elbows despite the morning chill, and a vest that had seen better seasons. His hair was the color of burnished copper, tousled by wind and work, and when he looked up at the sound of her approach, she was struck by the most remarkable eyes, grey as storm clouds, yet warm with an inner light that spoke of genuine kindness. "Miss," he said, straightening quickly and touching his cap in a gesture of respect. "Forgive me, I didn't expect to encounter a lady on this path." His voice carried the gentle cadence of the countryside, refined by what she suspected was a better education than his station suggested. There was no subservience in his manner, only natural courtesy, and Violet found herself stepping closer instead of retreating as propriety demanded. "Please, don't apologize," she said, her own voice sounding foreign to her ears after days of silence. "I heard the commotion and thought perhaps I could help. Are you injured?" He shook his head, a rueful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Only my pride, I'm afraid. The wheel caught a rut, and before I knew it, my morning's work was decorating the countryside." He gestured toward the scattered produce. "I'm afraid I'll be gathering turnips until midday." Something in his easy acceptance of misfortune, his willingness to find humor in disaster, loosened something tight in Violet's chest. "Then let me help you," she said, already moving toward the nearest fallen sack. "Oh, no, miss, I couldn't," he began. But Violet was already kneeling in the damp earth, gathering scattered potatoes in her skirts. "I insist," she said, looking up at him with a determination that surprised them both. "It's the least I can do." For a moment he studied her face with those remarkable grey eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through to her soul. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and returned to his own salvage efforts. They worked in companionable silence, and Violet found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion. His movements were efficient and practiced, speaking of years spent in physical labor, yet there was something else about him. A carefulness in how he handled even the humblest vegetables, a consideration for the smallest details that suggested a thoughtful nature. "I'm Jasper," he said suddenly, as if reading her curiosity. "Jasper Thorne. I work the Whitmore farm, just beyond the ridge." "Violet," she replied, then caught herself. "Miss Ashworth." If he recognized the name, and given the gossip that surely traveled through the countryside like wildfire, he undoubtedly did, he gave no sign of it. Instead, he simply nodded and continued gathering grain from where it had spilled across the road. "Miss Ashworth," he repeated thoughtfully. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Was he referring to his overturned cart, or to the scandal that had surely reached every farm and cottage within miles? But his expression revealed nothing beyond polite concern, and she found herself relaxing despite her natural wariness. When they had gathered the last of the scattered goods, Jasper turned his attention to the cart itself. The wheel had indeed caught in a deep rut, and the wooden axle was wedged firmly in the muddy depression. He positioned himself to lift, and Violet instinctively moved to help, her hands finding purchase alongside his on the cart's edge. "On my count," he said, and she was surprised by the way he included her naturally in the task, without the protests about propriety she would have expected from any gentleman of her acquaintance. Together they heaved the cart from its prison, Violet's strength adding just enough leverage to free the stubborn wheel. The effort left them both breathing hard, and when Jasper smiled at her, a genuine expression of gratitude that reached his eyes, she felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with exertion. "Thank you," he said simply. "I couldn't have managed it alone." The words were ordinary, but the way he spoke them made Violet feel as though she had accomplished something meaningful for the first time in her life. Here was a man who accepted her help without condescension, who treated her as a capable person rather than a delicate ornament to be protected and admired. As Jasper harnessed his mare and loaded the salvaged goods back onto the cart, Violet found herself reluctant to see the encounter end. When had she last felt so useful, so genuinely needed? "The road can be treacherous this time of year," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. Perhaps you might consider the eastern path in future. It's longer, but the drainage is better. Jasper paused in his work, studying her with those thoughtful grey eyes. You know these roads well, then? I walk them most mornings, she admitted. She stopped herself, unwilling to voice the pain that still sat like a stone in her chest. Since you've had reason to seek solitude, he finished gently, and there was such understanding in his voice that Violet felt tears prick at her eyes. Yes, she whispered. He was quiet for a moment, securing the last of the ropes that held his cargo. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, respectful. Sometimes the world disappoints us in ways we never imagined possible, but morning walks in good company have a way of restoring one's faith in unexpected kindness. The words were perfectly proper, yet Violet heard the invitation hidden within them. He was suggesting, gently, without presumption, that they might encounter each other again on these quiet roads. The very idea should have scandalized her, but instead, she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the strengthening sun. Indeed they do, she replied softly. Jasper touched his cap once more, that same gesture of natural courtesy. Good day to you, Miss Ashworth. And thank you again for your kindness. As his cart rolled away down the winding road, Violet stood watching until it disappeared beyond the trees. For the first time since Edmund's betrayal, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow. The eastern path became Violet's refuge. Each morning for the following week, she found herself drawn to the winding route that Jasper's cart now travelled, though she told herself it was merely for the superior drainage and peaceful solitude. The lie felt thin, even to her own heart, especially when she began timing her walks to coincide with his morning deliveries to the market towns beyond Millhaven. On the fourth such encounter, their polite nods had evolved into brief conversations about the weather and the changing season. By the sixth, Jasper had dismounted from his cart entirely, walking alongside her while his patient mare followed behind. The propriety of it should have concerned her, but Violet found that the opinions of Millhaven society, which had once governed her every action, now seemed as distant and irrelevant as last summer's fashions. This particular morning dawned with a heavy mist that turned the familiar countryside into something ethereal and strange. Violet pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she made her way down the path, her footsteps muffled by the thick air. The world seemed hushed, waiting, as if the very landscape held its breath. She heard Jasper's cart before she saw it, the gentle creak of wheels and the soft snuffle of his mare finding their way through the grey veil. When they emerged from the mist like figures from a dream, Violet felt her heart perform that peculiar flutter that had become increasingly familiar. "Good morning, Miss Ashworth," Jasper called softly, his voice carrying oddly in the heavy air. "Rather like walking through clouds today, isn't it?" "Indeed," she replied, falling into step beside him as naturally as if they had known each other for years rather than days. "I've always loved mornings like this. They make the world feel private, as though all its secrets are hidden in the mist." Jasper glanced at her with those storm-grey eyes, and she was struck again by how carefully he seemed to listen, as though her words carried weight and meaning beyond mere pleasantries. "And do you have secrets, Miss Ashworth?" he asked gently. "Hidden in the mist?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. Any gentleman of her acquaintance would have confined their conversation to safe topics, the weather, perhaps a book they had both read, certainly nothing as intimate as secrets. But Jasper asked as though he genuinely wished to know her, not merely to pass time in polite conversation. "Don't we all?" she deflected, then found herself adding with unexpected honesty, "though I suspect mine are hardly secret anymore. The entirety of the county seems to know that Edmund chose another. She had not meant to speak his name, had tried to lock it away with all the other painful memories, but something about the concealing mist and Jasper's quiet presence made the words slip free. "Ah," Jasper said simply, without the rush of sympathy or awkward platitude she had come to dread. The gossips do love their stories, don't they? Though I suspect they rarely get them quite right. What do you mean? Violet asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Jasper was quiet for a moment, guiding his mare around a particularly deep puddle. Only that gossip tends to focus on the drama of the moment, the announcement, the shock, the spectacle, but it rarely touches on what really matters. And what really matters? How it felt, he said simply, what it meant to you, whether the man was worthy of your affection in the first place, or merely someone who looked the part. His words struck something deep in Violet's chest, a recognition she hadn't expected. Because wasn't that exactly what she'd been discovering during these long, sleepless nights? That her grief wasn't just for Edmund himself, but for the future she had imagined, the role she had thought she would play as his wife. You speak as though you know something of disappointment yourself, she observed. Jasper's smile was rueful. I've learned that life rarely unfolds as we expect it to. I was meant to be a schoolmaster once upon a time, had my future all planned out, a position at a respectable academy, perhaps eventually a small school of my own. What happened? Violet asked softly. My father fell ill during harvest season 3 years ago. The farm needed someone to step in, to ensure the family wouldn't lose everything they'd worked for. Duty called louder than dreams. He shrugged, but Violet caught something in his expression, not bitterness exactly, but a wistfulness that spoke of carefully buried hopes. Do you regret it? How can I regret caring for my family? He replied, then paused thoughtfully. Though I confess, there are mornings when I miss the idea of shaping young minds, of helping them discover the wonder in books and learning. Violet felt a profound shift in her understanding of this man who had seemed so content with his simple life. Beneath the capable farmer was a scholar, someone who had sacrificed his own ambitions for love and duty. The realization made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. You could still teach, she said impulsively. The village children receive so little proper education. Surely, a working farmer who presumes to educate the children of his betters. Jasper's tone was mild, but Violet heard the edge of old frustration. I fear society has rather firm opinions about such things. The observation stung because it was true. Violet herself had never questioned the rigid social boundaries that dictated who could teach, who could learn, who could aspire to better circumstances. Yet here was a man whose intelligence and kindness seemed to outshine every gentleman of her acquaintance, relegated to hauling turnips because of an accident of birth. That's terribly unfair, she said with sudden vehemence. Perhaps, Jasper agreed. But fairness isn't something the world promises us, is it? We make our peace with what we're given and try to find contentment in small victories. Small victories, he gestured toward the mist-shrouded landscape around them. A good harvest, an honest day's work, a conversation with an interesting companion on a morning walk. The last phrase was spoken so quietly that Violet almost missed it. But when she looked up, she found Jasper watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was nothing improper in his gaze, nothing that overstepped the bounds of propriety, yet she felt seen in a way that Edmund's passionate declarations had never accomplished. "Mr. Thorne," she began, then stopped, uncertain of what she had meant to say. "Jasper," he corrected gently. "If we're to be walking companions, I think we might dispense with excessive formality." The suggestion was scandalous by any measure. A lady of her station simply did not use a labourer's Christian name, just as she certainly should not be walking unaccompanied with any man, let alone one so far beneath her social rank. Yet Violet found herself nodding before propriety could voice its protests. "Jasper," she repeated, surprised by how natural the name felt on her lips. "And you must call me Violet." "Violet," he said, and somehow her own name sounded different when he spoke it, not the formal address of society, but something warmer, more personal. They had reached the fork in the road where their paths would diverge, his toward the market towns, hers back to the suffocating propriety of Millhaven Estate. But neither seemed eager to part. "Tomorrow is Sunday," Violet said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I won't be walking." "Of course," Jasper replied. "Church services and family obligations." "Monday, then?" The words escaped before she could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at her own forwardness. But Jasper's smile was gentle, understanding. "Monday," he agreed, "weather permitting." Weather. As she watched his cart disappear into the mist, Violet realized that somewhere between the scattered turnips and this morning's quiet confessions, something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer simply escaping her humiliation during these walks. She was walking toward something new, something that felt dangerously like hope. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, as she turned toward home, Violet found herself already counting the hours until Monday morning. Winter arrived earlier than expected, bringing with it a sharp frost that turned the morning meadows into crystalline wonderlands. Violet had grown to treasure these frozen mornings when her breath mingled with Jasper's in small white clouds and their footsteps left parallel tracks in the silver grass. 3 weeks had passed since their first encounter, and she had come to depend on these dawn meetings as the only bright moments in her increasingly complicated world. The scandal of Edmund's betrayal had settled into a dull ache rather than the sharp agony of those first days, but its consequences continued to unfold like ripples in a disturbed pond. Letters had arrived from distant relatives expressing their concern in language that barely concealed their satisfaction at her downfall. Invitations that would normally have flooded Millhaven had dried to a trickle, and those few social obligations she still maintained felt like performances of normalcy that exhausted her soul. Only with Jasper did she feel truly herself, not the disgraced daughter of Lord Ashworth, not the woman publicly humiliated by her faithless betrothed, but simply Violet, a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered to someone else. This particular Monday morning, however, brought an unwelcome surprise. As Violet made her way down the familiar path, she spotted a second figure waiting beside Jasper's cart, a woman of middle years dressed in practical grey wool, her greying hair pinned severely beneath a plain bonnet. Even from a distance, Violet could sense the tension in Jasper's posture, the careful way he held himself as though braced for conflict. "Violet," he said as she approached, his voice carrying a warning she didn't quite understand. "I'd like you to meet my aunt, Mrs. Eleanor Thorne. She manages the household while I see to the farming." The woman's sharp blue eyes moved from Jasper to Violet with undisguised assessment. There was intelligence in that gaze, and a protective fierceness that reminded Violet of a mother bird defending her nest. "Miss Ashworth," Mrs. Thorne said, offering a curtsy that was perfectly correct, yet somehow managed to convey disapproval. "I've heard a great deal about you." "Have you?" Violet replied carefully, uncertain of the undercurrents she sensed flowing between aunt and nephew. "Indeed, my nephew has mentioned your morning encounters. As his family, I felt it necessary to meet the lady who has captured so much of his attention." The words were spoken with careful politeness, but Violet heard the steel beneath them. This woman knew exactly what these meetings meant, understood the dangerous territory that she and Jasper had been exploring with their growing friendship. "Mrs. Thorne," Jasper said quietly, "perhaps this conversation might wait." "No, nephew," the older woman interrupted, her gaze never leaving Violet's face. "I think it's best spoken plainly, don't you? Miss Ashworth, you seem a kind young lady, and I'm sure your intentions are innocent, but surely you must understand how these meetings appear to others." Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks, but there was something in Mrs. Thorne's manner that demanded honesty rather than social pleasantries. "I confess I hadn't considered—" "Of course you hadn't," Mrs. Thorne said, not unkindly. "Ladies of your station rarely need to consider such things. But Jasper's reputation, his future prospects, even his safety, these things hang by threads that can be cut by the smallest scandal." The words hit Violet like cold water. In all her focus on her own healing, her own need for kindness and understanding. She had never considered the risk she might be placing on Jasper. A lady's ruined reputation was a social inconvenience. A working man's destroyed character could mean destitution, or worse. "Aunt Eleanor," Jasper said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "you overstep." "Do I, Mrs.?" Thorne turned to face him, and Violet saw years of worry and love in that stern face. "The village already whispers, Jasper, about the fancy lady who walks with the farmer's nephew, about how she looks at you, and how you look at her. Do you think such talk will help your prospects? Or hers?" Violet watched the exchange with growing dismay. She had thought their meetings secret, their growing affection hidden in the privacy of morning mist and empty roads. But of course others had seen, had talked, had drawn their own conclusions about the impossible gulf between her world and his. "What are you suggesting?" Violet asked quietly. Mrs. Thorne's expression softened slightly, perhaps in recognition of genuine distress. "Only that you consider what future you imagine for yourself, Miss Ashworth, and whether it's fair to encourage feelings that can lead nowhere but heartbreak." The brutal honesty of it took Violet's breath away. Because wasn't that exactly what she had been avoiding thinking about? The way her heart raced when she saw Jasper's cart approaching, the disappointment that colored her entire day when weather kept them apart, the growing certainty that what she felt for this gentle, intelligent man was deeper and truer than anything she had ever felt for Edmund. "I should go," Violet said suddenly, the weight of impossible circumstances crushing down upon her. "Violet, wait!" Jasper stepped forward, his hand reaching toward her before propriety, and his aunt's watchful gaze stopped him. "Your aunt is right," Violet said, her voice barely steady. "I've been selfish, thinking only of my own comfort. I never considered what harm I might bring to you." "You've brought no harm," Jasper said fiercely. "Only light to mornings that were grey before you arrived." The words were beautiful and terrible, confirming everything Mrs. Thorne had suspected about the dangerous depth of feeling between them. Violet saw the older woman's face tighten with worry, and something that might have been pity. "Jasper," Violet whispered, "we both know this is impossible." "Because society says so," he challenged, stepping closer despite his aunt's sharp intake of breath. "Because an accident of birth means we cannot find happiness together?" "Because I am ruined goods," Violet said, the words tumbling out in a rush of pain and honesty. "Because no gentleman will have me now, and you deserve better than a woman who would drag you down into scandal and shame." "I don't give a damn about scandal," Jasper said, his composure finally cracking. "And I certainly don't care what society's gentlemen think of you or me or anything else." "Jasper!" Mrs. Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. "Mind your language in front of a lady!" But Violet barely heard the rebuke. She was staring at Jasper, seeing the raw emotion in his grey eyes, the careful control he had maintained finally shattered by the impossibility of their situation. "You should care," she said softly, "because caring is what protects the people we love." The word hung in the air between them, love, unspoken but suddenly undeniable. Violet saw recognition dawn in Jasper's face, watched as he understood what she was really saying. "Don't," he said roughly, "don't sacrifice what we have for the good opinions of people who aren't worthy to speak your name." "And what exactly do we have?" Violet asked, her voice breaking. "Secret meetings on country roads, stolen conversations that must end with sunrise. What future can we build on foundations of whispers and shame?" Mrs. Thorne watched this exchange with the expression of someone witnessing a tragedy she was powerless to prevent. When neither Jasper nor Violet spoke, she stepped forward with the authority of age and experience. "Miss Ashworth," she said gently, "you're a woman of education and sensitivity. Surely you understand that some walls cannot be torn down by good intentions alone." Violet nodded miserably because she did understand. The social order that governed their world was not some abstract concept. It was a living, breathing force that shaped every aspect of their lives. To challenge it openly would destroy them both. "I should return home," she said, her voice hollow with defeat. "Violet," Jasper began, but she was already turning away. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Thorne, "for speaking truthfully. It's more kindness than I deserved." As she walked away, Violet heard the low murmur of voices behind her, Jasper and his aunt, no doubt discussing the damage that had been done and the steps that must be taken to repair it. She quickened her pace, desperate to escape before the tears that threatened could fall where they might be witnessed. But even as she fled toward the false safety of Millhaven Estate, one truth echoed in her mind with crystalline clarity. She loved Jasper Thorne with a depth and certainty that made her previous feelings for Edmund seem like childish infatuation. And that love, pure and true as it was, could only bring them both ruin. 2 weeks passed in grey misery. Violet confined herself to Millhaven Estate, avoiding the Eastern Path and the temptation it represented. She threw herself into household duties with desperate energy, reorganizing the library, cataloguing the estate's correspondence, anything to keep her hands busy and her heart from dwelling on storm-grey eyes and gentle words. Her father watched her self-imposed exile with growing concern, but his attempts at conversation met only polite deflection. How could she explain that she was protecting herself from the greatest happiness she had ever known, because that happiness threatened to destroy the man she loved? The first snow of winter was falling on a Thursday morning when Martha knocked on her chamber door with unusual urgency. "Miss Violet," the maid said, her voice breathless with excitement. "There's someone to see you, in the morning room." Violet's heart leapt before reason could intervene. "Who?" "A lady, miss. Mrs. Thorne," she said, "claims it's a matter of great importance." Violet's hands trembled as she smoothed her hair and checked her appearance in the mirror. What could have brought Jasper's aunt to Millhaven? Had something happened to him? The thought sent ice through her veins as she hurried down the stairs. Mrs. Thorne stood at the morning room window, watching the snow fall across the formal gardens. She turned as Violet entered, and her expression was unlike anything Violet had seen before, not stern disapproval, but something that might have been hope mixed with determination. "Mrs. Thorne," Violet said carefully, "this is unexpected. Miss Ashworth." The older woman moved away from the window, and Violet noticed she carried a worn leather satchel. "I've come to discuss something that cannot wait any longer. If this is about Jasper—" "Everything is about Jasper," Mrs. Thorne interrupted, but not harshly, "and about you, and about the future that stubborn nephew of mine refuses to fight for because he thinks it would be selfish." Violet sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "I don't understand." Mrs. Thorne seated herself across from Violet, placing the satchel carefully on the small table between them. "When I spoke to you that morning, I thought I was protecting my nephew from certain heartbreak, but watching him these past weeks has shown me that heartbreak has found him anyway. Mrs. Thorne, surely you understand why I had to stop." "What I understand," the older woman said firmly, "is that love like yours comes perhaps once in a lifetime, if we're fortunate, and that I was a fool to think society's rules were more important than human happiness." Violet stared at her, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "Jasper has been miserable," Mrs. Thorne continued. "He tends his crops and delivers his goods and says all the proper words, but the light has gone out of him. He's like a man walking through his own life instead of living it." "But you said—" "I said what I believed was prudent. I was wrong." Mrs. Thorne opened the leather satchel and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. "Do you know what these are?" Violet shook her head, mesmerized by the careful way Mrs. Thorne handled the documents. "Letters of recommendation, from the headmaster of Jasper's Academy, from the parish priest who taught him Latin, from the university professor who said he had the finest mind for literature he'd encountered in 20 years of teaching." Mrs. Thorne's voice grew soft with pride and old pain. "All written before our family's circumstances changed. I don't understand why you're showing me these." "Because I've been thinking, Miss Ashworth, about walls that can't be torn down, and whether perhaps they might be climbed instead." Mrs. Thorne spread the letters on the table, and Violet saw the official seals, the elegant handwriting, the weight of institutional authority that each document carried. "There's a school," Mrs. Thorne said quietly, "in the next county, a progressive institution that values merit over birth, that serves children whose parents can afford education but not the prejudices of traditional academies." Violet's heart began to race as she understood the implication. "The headmistress is a woman of unconventional views," Mrs. Thorne continued. "She wrote to me last month, having heard through some channel about Jasper's situation. She wondered if he might consider a position there. She would hire him, despite his circumstances. She would hire him because of his mind and his character. The school serves the children of merchants, reformed clergymen, even some who have made their fortunes in trade. People who value substance over pedigree." Violet felt tears prick at her eyes. "And I think a schoolmaster's wife need not come from the finest family so long as she brings intelligence and kindness to her role. I think scandal that seems insurmountable in one county might matter very little in another, especially when time and distance have softened its edges." The possibility hung between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. A new life, a chance for happiness, a future that neither Violet nor Jasper had dared to imagine. "But would he—" Violet began, then stopped, afraid to voice the hope rising in her chest. "Leave Millhaven, abandon the farm he's worked so hard to maintain." Mrs. Thorne smiled, and for the first time Violet saw warmth in that stern face. "In a heartbeat, if he knew you would come with him. The farm will survive. My son is old enough now to take on the responsibility, and eager to do so. Jasper has given 3 years of his life to duty. Perhaps it's time he claimed some happiness for himself." Violet rose from her chair, unable to remain still under the weight of such unexpected possibility. "You would truly give us your blessing?" "My dear girl," Mrs. Thorne said gently, "I've watched that boy sacrifice his dreams once for family obligation. I won't watch him sacrifice love for social convention." The tears came then, hot and relieved, washing away weeks of carefully maintained composure. Mrs. Thorne rose and placed a motherly hand on Violet's shoulder, offering the comfort of understanding without judgment. "There would be challenges," the older woman said honestly. "You would be the wife of a schoolmaster, not a lord's daughter. The society you were born to would likely never fully accept you again." "I don't care," Violet said fiercely, surprising them both with her vehemence. "Society had its chance to value me and chose to discard me when I became inconvenient. If this is my opportunity to build something real, something meaningful, then you'll take it." Violet thought of Jasper's gentle hands, his thoughtful eyes, the way he had made her feel valued for her mind and heart rather than her bloodline and dowry. She thought of children who might benefit from his teaching, of a life built on love and mutual respect rather than social obligation. "Where is he now?" she asked. Mrs. Thorne's smile was radiant. "Walking the eastern path, I believe. He goes there every morning, though he pretends it's for the exercise." Violet was already moving toward the door, her heart singing with possibility. "Will you wait for us? There are arrangements to make, letters to write." "I'll wait," Mrs. Thorne assured her. "Take all the time you need to say what should have been said weeks ago." The snow was falling more heavily now, turning the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Violet ran through it without regard for her slippers or her carefully arranged hair, her breath forming clouds of joy as she raced toward the eastern path and the future that awaited her there. She found Jasper standing beneath the old oak tree where they had shared so many conversations, his shoulders dusted with snow, his face turned toward the grey sky as though searching for answers in the falling flakes. "Jasper!" she called, and he turned toward her voice with an expression of such startled hope that her heart nearly broke with tenderness. "Violet?" He stepped toward her, his eyes drinking in her face, as though he had been lost in darkness and she was light itself. "What are you doing here? The weather—" "I don't care about the weather," she said, reaching for his hands with a boldness that would have scandalized her former self. "I don't care about gossip or scandal or any of it. I care about you." His hands closed around hers, warm and strong and achingly familiar. "Violet, we've discussed this. There's no future." "There is," she interrupted, her voice ringing with certainty. "Your aunt came to see me. There's a school, Jasper. A place where your mind would be valued, where we could build a life together." But she told him everything: the progressive academy, the headmistress's offer, the possibility of beginning again in a place where their love mattered more than their birthrights. She watched wonder dawn in his grey eyes, followed by a hope so profound it took her breath away. "You would do that?" he asked quietly. "Leave everything you've known for an uncertain future with a schoolmaster?" "The only uncertainty I fear is a future without you," she replied. "Everything I thought I wanted, status, security, society's approval, none of it means anything compared to this." Jasper cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the snowflakes that clung to her cheeks. "Violet Ashworth," he said softly, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes, yes, yes." He kissed her then, gentle and sure, sealing a promise that no scandal could break and no society could diminish. Around them, the snow continued to fall, blessing their future with its quiet benediction. When they finally broke apart, Violet saw that the storm clouds were clearing, revealing patches of blue sky and the promise of sunshine. Like her heart, the world was transforming, becoming something new and beautiful and full of hope. "Come," she said, taking his hand. "Your aunt is waiting. We have a wedding to plan and a life to begin." As they walked back toward Millhaven together, Violet reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. Edmund's betrayal, which had seemed like the end of her world, had instead freed her to discover a love deeper and truer than any she had imagined possible. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest gifts came disguised as the greatest sorrows, and sometimes the most beautiful futures grew from the ashes of shattered dreams.